Developed by Capcom and released originally for the Nintendo GameCube in January of 2005, Resident Evil 4 was directed by Shinji Mikami, who had led development of the first Resident Evil game back in 1996 and has since produced or supervised several other entries in the franchise. Production for a sequel to Resident Evil 3 Nemesis began in 1999, originally envisioned for the PlayStation 2. In early stages, the project's original director, Hideki Kamiya, who was returning from Resident Evil 2, wanted to create a cool and stylish action game, leaning less heavily on survival horror aspects, and felt that the typical fixed angles of Resident Evil games were not as cool as could be accomplished with a dynamic camera system. Eventually, this quest for coolness strayed too far from what producer Mikami wanted for the series, so part of the team, including then-director Kamiya, split off to create what would become Devil May Cry. Following this split, in 2001, development of Resident Evil 4 was restarted with designer Hiroshi Shibata at the helm, as the team worked their way through 4 major versions up till release. Each of the next 3 major versions featured returning protagonist Leon Kennedy taking on some sort of virus or disease in either a castle or other large building haunted by paranormal foes. Several team members strove to create a scarier Resident Evil than ever before, until original creator Shinji Mikami stepped in, deciding that the series had grown stale and formulaic and needed to be reinvented to avoid being boring. Mikami wrote an entirely new story that had nothing to do with the previously featured antagonistic corporation, Umbrella. The final product that we wound up with was so well crafted that it was named 2005's Game of the Year by numerous gaming publications, and the title received countless nominations and successful bids for awards in excellence of game design across several categories and consoles. The original North American GameCube version of Resident Evil 4 sold over 320,000 copies in under 3 weeks. By 2007, both the GameCube and PS2 editions totaled over 3.6 million copies shipped worldwide. Versions for PC and Nintendo Wii were released in 2006 and 2007 respectively, each containing cumulative bonus content from previous releases. A remake of Resident Evil 4 with modern graphics and updated gameplay was released in March of 2023 for PC, PS4, PS5, and the Xbox Series consoles. And while we'll be looking briefly at that version today, our focus overall will be on the original, influential release, which was arguably most notable for popularizing the over-the-shoulder format of third-person action and horror video games, notably seen in the Gears of War, Dead Space, and The Last of Us franchises. Ever since its blockbuster success on both the GameCube and PS2, Resident Evil 4 has been heralded as one of the greatest video games of all time, and a pivotal moment in the growth of third-person games, specifically those in the shooter, action, and horror genres. So, without further ado, let's uncover what's so great about Resident Evil 4. Following Leon S. Kennedy, one of the playable main characters from Resident Evil 2, this 4th main entry in the survival horror franchise takes place roughly 6 years after the destruction of Raccoon City in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Now an agent for the United States government, Leon's current high-priority mission is the search and rescue of the president's daughter, Ashley, who was kidnapped and taken to a rural village in Spain. Immediately upon reaching the site of his investigation, Leon is attacked by crazed villagers who have been ordered not to allow him near the president's daughter. From this point forward, it's up to the player to survive long enough to rescue Ashley and learn what's happened in this eerie rural community. The villagers who attack our protagonist aren't zombies, as they can still talk and seemingly carry out their day-to-day tasks, but they're definitely under the control or influence of something, with sickly physical features and a feverish drive towards violence. The fact that the hordes of enemies that threaten the player in this entry are no longer mindless zombies means they're more capable in their pursuit of our protagonist. The enemies in Resident Evil 4 don't just lurch and swipe at Leon, but actually arm themselves with pitchforks and flails, throw explosives, and they're even capable of climbing ladders and opening doors once they know that the player's nearby. When enemies get too close to Leon during combat, there may be a quick-time action prompt that allows the player to kick anyone who's immediately in front of him, stunning or defeating them outright, as well as knocking them off of high structures and into other foes. Quick-time events in general are often used during high-intensity moments to add stress to the player and challenge their reflexes, through actions that don't fit the usual third-person shooter inputs of the rest of the game, without interrupting the player's momentum or offensive strategery. The boss fights are all thrilling and original, and often feature some disturbing or much more creative monsters to fight than just a larger zombie, snake, or spider. Outside of explicitly recognizable boss battles, some notably suspenseful conflicts are created every so often by limiting how much the player is able to move while defending themselves, as well as any companion that may be with them. A couple examples of these include defending off a house as hordes of maniacal farmers crash through the windows, or picking off axe throwers on a moving ski lift before they can get within range of your car. The close positioning of the camera over Leon's shoulder draws the player into this game's action much better than fixed cameras or a wider, more centered third-person view. This way, whatever happens to Leon happens to the player. The usual position and angle of the camera also benefits Leon's right-handedness during firefights, allowing players to position themselves carefully along the edges of structures as a form of defensive cover. While exploring, tight, winding pathways are often used in tandem with the camera to obscure the player's view for the benefit of upcoming surprises, as well as a means of lessening the amount of foliage and other highly detailed set dressings that the hardware had to render within view. The action-heavy structure that forms most of the game is broken up by occasional environmental puzzles, such as pushing boxes and creating paths for Leon through more dangerous areas. The same goes for clearing traps out of the way, forcing the player to slow down a bit for safety's sake. The puzzles and mysteries found in this game feel very much like those of its predecessors in style, with the same round peg in the round hole sort of challenges that encourage players to search their surrounding environments for possible keys and switches, though don't outright require any particular knowledge for riddle solving or code breaking. Inventory management is just as big of a priority in this entry as its predecessors, with Leon having an attaché case that has to be organized more precisely with particularly sized items, rather than just a total number of items that can be carried. Regularly throughout each stage, the player will come across a secretive merchant who peddles a wide array of weapons, equipment, and upgrades, and even offers to buy any valuables the player has collected during their mission. The weapon tune-up system allows for more variety in playstyles for different audiences, such as those who prefer to pick off enemies from a distance whenever they can, or those who like to be prepared for close-up fights. The heavily limited amount of money that the player has to disperse across all of their weapons adds some real weight to each decision, as you never know how useful something would be to buy right away versus saving your money for a bigger purchase later on. The same goes for selling treasures, as some of them can be combined to create a singular, more valuable treasure, as long as none of its pieces were missed along the way. The later guns to be made available in the merchant's shop are more powerful than what Leon begins with, and can be drawn quicker in case of dire circumstances. However, their upgrades are much more expensive, slowing the growth of their reload speed and magazine capacity compared to the earlier weapons. The merchant also operates a series of target practice minigames, which challenge the player to score highly by only shooting specific targets in exchange for collectible bottle caps. When examined among the player's treasures, these bottle caps feature figurines of many of the game's characters in various poses and each reciting some catchphrases from the game. The target practice minigame, aside from being fun and offering bonus content to completionist players, actually does benefit the player as they practice switching between targets quickly, aiming for distant or moving targets, and making their shots count to avoid reloading at inopportune times. The laser sight on the player's gun allows for much finer accuracy than a slight tilt up or down, as had been possible in previous Resident Evil adventures. The absence of the now commonplace crosshair, as it become popularized by first-person shooters, keeps the player's field of view more cinematically unobscured and only provides help with aiming when the player actually draws their weapon. The gunplay is so accurate in this game that aside from dealing different damage based on where an enemy is hit, like most other shooters, the player can also shoot thrown projectiles such as axes and dynamite out of the air. You can even shoot down arrows mid-flight. Once the player finds Ashley, Leon can give her commands to either follow him or wait where she is. She can also work alongside Leon to access new areas and open certain doors. The player also doesn't have to worry about getting her to follow weird routes if they take a shortcut, for instance after jumping off a roof, because Ashley can follow with just the push of a button. For the segments in which she's involved, Ashley's companionship feels like a direct predecessor to the existence of Ellie in The Last of Us and Elizabeth in BioShock Infinite, as she shouts out information that the player may not easily notice from their point of view, and changes the flow of gameplay through her dependency on our hero. That is to say, during some puzzles, the player will have to cover Ashley with suppressing fire as she completes a task out of Leon's reach. Every so often, the game will find opportunities to separate Ashley from Leon in order to alleviate the task of defending and escorting her, often allowing more chaotic combat segments in which Ashley would just be in the way to a frustrating degree. Although, in an impressive display of companion AI for 2005, Ashley does her best to stay out of the player's line of fire. If the player is facing away from her, Ashley will hide behind Leon, and if the player is facing her when their gun is drawn, she'll duck out of the way. For those curious on how to experience Resident Evil 4 without an old GameCube copy, there's also the modern 2023 remake, which wound up being nominated for several gaming awards for its release year as well, and even sold over 3 million copies in its first 2 days. Obviously, the visuals are substantially improved after nearly 2 decades, but the game's world was given a ground-up redesign to create more realistic environments that provided more interesting gameplay. Even having played the original 2005 version just months before the remaster, this new version had so much new content to offer that it was just as engaging as if I had never played the original. 2 of my biggest complaints with the original release of the game, those being a lack of stealth mechanics and subpar enemy intelligence, were both not only added or improved upon in the remake, but became some of its most enjoyable features in my opinion. The shooting gallery minigame was also completely reworked, and several bonus challenges and optional side quests were added to increase the longevity and replayability of the game. In fact, the remake is so faithfully modernized and impressively expanded that it will most likely need its own video on this channel one day. Resident Evil 4 was very much a next-gen release for its era. It doesn't really even seem like it should have been possible on the GameCube when one of the most popular horror games to compare it to on this hardware would have been Luigi's Mansion at the beginning of the console's lifespan. Aside from finely crafted models and high-quality textures, the weather effects in this haunting rural setting are also phenomenal. The wind, fog, lightning, rain, sunlight, everything works well together in order to create a very authentic atmosphere, even as gaming entered its color-filtered phase of navies, tans, and greens to soften and blur away that last little gap in visual acuity that video game hardware was still incapable of. Playing this game immediately makes every prior entry in Resident Evil feel archaic by comparison. This title's characters, acting, and attention to detail given towards motion capture and facial animations were all intensely praised by gaming journalists as a huge step above what had typically been seen in this franchise. With particular focus in cutscenes and the Metal Gear-inspired communicator, we're provided with some very realistic and impressive performances, which is extremely refreshing in the face of this franchise's earlier attempts at voice acting. As can be witnessed by simply comparing still images of their games, members of development studio Naughty Dog have mentioned taking inspiration from Resident Evil 4 during production of The Last of Us, and the designers of Dead Space mentioned that they were originally working on a project intended to become System Shock 3 until Capcom's successful release redirected their attention towards the potential of third-person horror. The teams behind several other major games, including BioShock, Bloodborne, and God of War, have cited influences from Resident Evil 4 as well. The learning curve, difficulty curve, and overall experience of this game are all incredibly well paced, as Resident Evil 4 introduces new mechanics and more powerful enemies at an easily managed rate, while also changing the player's responsibilities every so often, as well as slowly reducing the number of characters within reach to help Leon to create a more dire and isolated quest for survival as the adventure unfolds. As far as the horror genre is concerned, this title isn't particularly scary, but it is definitely horrific, with eerie settings, grotesque monsters, and some disturbing storytelling to tie all of the action together for an exciting, groundbreaking adventure. That is what's so great about Resident Evil 4. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we explored the quality and influence of Resident Evil 4. If you want to support the channel, make sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and do whatever else the algorithm demands of us to keep up with our favorite content. Also, consider joining our gaming community on Discord or watching bonus videos on Patreon. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Super Mario World, on screen or in the description. And let us know your thoughts on Resident Evil 4 and what games you'd like to see in the future. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.